The morning of our civil ceremony, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of rain tapping against the bedroom window. I lay there for a moment, eyes still closed, letting myself feel it, the quiet, the warmth of the sheets, the knowledge that today was supposed to be one of the best days of my life. Daniel had already gotten up. I could hear him moving softly in the kitchen downstairs, probably making the hazelnut blend I loved. The one he always brewed on mornings. He wanted to do something nice without saying it out loud. We weren't doing a big wedding. That was coming in September, with the flowers and the venue and the dress I'd spent 4 months choosing. Today was just the civil registration, small, simple. His parents, my father, a few close friends, in and out of City Hall in 40 minutes, then lunch at a restaurant 2 blocks away. I should have known that nothing involving Margaret Holt stayed small for long. I'd met Daniel 3 years earlier at a conference in Boston, where we'd both ended up stranded at the same hotel bar during a thunderstorm. He was funny in that quiet, self-deprecating way that takes you completely off guard. He asked good questions. He actually listened to the answers. By the time the storm cleared, I had his number. And though I wouldn't admit it to myself for another 2 weeks, something that felt dangerously close to certainty. We dated for 8 months before he introduced me to his family. And even then, I'd been given a warning. Not from him, but from his older sister, Claire, who pulled me aside at Thanksgiving and said in a voice carefully stripped of inflection, "My mother has very specific ideas about how things should be done. Just brace yourself." I'd laughed it off. I was 31 years old, a licensed architect with my own apartment, my own income, and my own very well-developed sense of self. I figured I could handle one opinionated mother-in-law. Margaret Holt was 63, slim in the way of who treated discipline as a moral virtue, and perpetually dressed as though she expected to run into a photographer. She wore her silver hair in a precise chenille, and had a smile that she deployed like a tool, warm enough to disarm you, not quite reaching her eyes. She'd been widowed when Daniel was 19, and in the years since, she had quietly, methodically made herself the gravitational centre of her family. Daniel called her every Sunday without fail. He asked her opinion on apartments before he signed leases. When he got promoted at his firm 2 years ago, he told her before he told me. Not out of malice, I think, but out of something so deeply habituated it had become reflex. I noticed these things. I filed them. I told myself they were manageable. What I hadn't told myself, what I had carefully, deliberately refused to fully think, was what it would mean to marry into that particular orbit permanently. The civil ceremony was scheduled for 11 in the morning. I arrived at City Hall at 10:40, with my father, Richard, who had driven up from Philadelphia the night before, and was wearing the navy blazer I'd bought him for Christmas. He looked nervous. Fathers look nervous when they're trying not to look nervous. Jaw slightly tight, eyes doing a quiet sweep of every room we entered. "You look beautiful," he said when I stepped out of the car. And the way he said it, careful, full of something unsaid, made me squeeze his hand and hold on for just a second longer than necessary. Daniel was waiting on the steps, and when he saw me, his face did the thing I loved. That involuntary softening, like all the tension he carried in his shoulders, just dissolved. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the blue tie I'd picked out. He kissed me on the cheek and kept his hand at the small of my back as we walked up the steps together. And in that moment, everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Margaret was already inside. She was standing in the lobby with Daniel's aunt Patricia and his cousin Renee. All three of them in coordinated shades of cream and ivory, which struck me as a choice. Margaret Eyre kissed me on both cheeks and told me I looked lovely, the words sitting in her mouth like something politely endured. Patricia smiled. Renee had her phone out and was already filming. My father shook hands all around with the careful, measured warmth of a man reserving judgment. Our friend group, Lena, Marcus and Jonah, arrived just behind us, filling the lobby with actual warmth and noise. Lena hugged me for a long time. "You okay?" she whispered. "Perfect," I said, and I meant it. The register, a pleasant woman in her 50s named Mrs. Ellison, led us into the ceremonial room, a wood-panelled space with tall windows, rows of cushioned chairs and a long table at the front. Not grand, but dignified, exactly what I'd wanted. Daniel and I sat at the table facing Mrs. Ellison. The guests settled into chairs behind us. Rain streaked the windows. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper. Mrs. Ellison smiled at us and opened the ceremony with the standard language, the legal weight of what we were about to sign, the meaning of commitment, the simple, serious beauty of a civil union. I felt Daniel's knee press lightly against mine under the table. I exhaled. Then Margaret stood up. I heard the chair scrape before I saw her rise, and something in the sound of it, deliberate, unhurried, made the back of my neck go very still. Mrs. Ellison paused mid-sentence, visibly surprised. Daniel turned, I turned. Margaret was standing in the third row, a cream-coloured envelope in both hands, held out in front of her like an offering. "I hope you'll forgive a small interruption," she said with a smile that communicated the opposite of apology. "In our family, we have a tradition." She paused, letting the word land, letting it do its work. Before the signing, the women in the family read the wife's duties aloud as a way of welcoming her into the family and ensuring everyone understands the commitment she is making. She looked at Mrs. Ellison. "It only takes a few minutes." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people all have the same thought, and none of them are sure yet whether they're allowed to say it. I looked at Daniel. His jaw had tightened. His eyes were on his mother. He said nothing. Mrs. Ellison glanced at me with a question in her expression. I gave her a small nod, not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear exactly what was in that envelope. Margaret opened the flap with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this many times in private. She unfolded 3 pages, and cleared her throat. "Rule 1, she began. "A wife's first responsibility is to her husband's household, not her career." I sat very still. My hands rested flat on the table. "Rule 2, a wife should not make financial decisions without consulting her husband." "Rule 3, a wife should ensure her husband is treated with the same, if not greater, respect than her own family." She glanced up briefly. The smirk was there, faint, satisfied, tucked into the corners of her mouth like a secret she'd been saving. She looked back down. "Rule 4. A wife's working hours should never interfere with the preparation of family meals." She continued. "Rule 5, Rule 6, Rule 7. I stopped counting and started listening differently. Not to the words themselves, but to the architecture beneath them. Each rule was phrased as tradition, as wisdom, as love. But what they added up to read in sequence, in that wood-panelled room in front of my friends and my father, was a blueprint. A very specific, very carefully designed blueprint for who I was supposed to become once I signed that document. Rule 10, Rule 11, Rule 12. 12 rules, 3 pages, prepared in advance, printed in a clean serif font, tucked into a cream envelope, and brought to City Hall with the deliberate intention of reading them in front of witnesses. My father's face and my peripheral vision had gone the colour of old granite. Lena had stopped moving entirely. Daniel was looking at the table. When Margaret finished, she refolded the pages with a crisp precision that was its own kind of punctuation, slid them back into the envelope and looked at me with that smile, warm on the surface, something else entirely underneath. "Welcome to the family, Clara," she said. The room waited. Mrs. Ellison looked at me. My father looked at me. Daniel finally looked at me. I reached across the table and picked up the microphone that Mrs. Ellison used for larger ceremonies. I tapped it once to confirm it was live. The small speaker in the corner of the room hummed. I looked at Margaret. I spoke clearly without raising my voice, without any particular rush. "I'm an architect," I said. "I build structures meant to last. And I've just listened to 12 reasons why this one won't." I set the microphone down. "Mrs. Ellison, I'd like to rest you." The silence was absolute. Margaret's smile did not disappear all at once. It dissolved slowly in stages, the way ice does, when the temperature shifts, until what was left was something I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not embarrassment, something rarer than either. The realization that the room had just watched her plan fail in real time in public in front of every person she had chosen as her audience. I pushed my chair back, stood, and looked at Daniel. What happened in the next 10 seconds would determine everything. Daniel looked at me the way people look at something they recognize but can no longer name. His mouth opened slightly, not to speak, just to breathe, as though the air in the room had suddenly changed composition. Behind him, Margaret had sat back down, spine perfectly straight, envelope held in both hands against her lap. The smirk was gone. In its place was something controlled and watchful, the expression of a chess player who has just seen an unexpected move and is already calculating the response. My father stood up. That was the first thing that broke the silence. Not just the sound of his chair and the quiet authority of a 60-year-old man rising to his full height. He didn't look at Margaret. He looked at me, and what was in his eyes was not surprise. It was recognition. He had known something was wrong before the ceremony started. I understood that now, reading his face, and he had been waiting to see how it would unfold. Mrs. Ellison cleared her throat with professional diplomacy. "Perhaps we should take a short recess," she said, in the tone of someone who has navigated more than one difficult family situation inside this particular room. She rose up from her chair, gathered her folder, and stepped quietly to the side, giving the space back to us. Lena was already on her feet. Marcus put a hand on Jonah's arm. "Stay." And the three of them held their positions with the careful stillness of people who understood this was not their moment to fill. Daniel finally spoke. "Clara, my name, just my name with no sentence attached to it, which told me everything I needed to know about where he was in that moment. Not with me, not against his mother. suspended in the exact paralysis I had watched build over 3 years of Sunday phone calls and deferred decisions and careful silences in rooms where Margaret held the floor. Clara, can we talk outside for a moment? I looked at him for a long beat, not with anger. Anger would come later in waves at inconvenient times in the car and in the shower, and at 3 in the morning. What I felt right then was something colder and more precise. I was looking at him the way you look at a building you've assessed for structural integrity and found wanting. Not with surprise, with clarity. Yes, I said. We can talk outside. I walked past Margaret without looking at her. I heard Patricia whisper something to Renee, too low to catch. I heard the soft scuff of my father's shoes as he fell into step slightly behind me. Not intruding, just present, and the warmth of that small act of solidarity hit me harder than I expected. I pushed through the heavy door into the corridor, and the sound of the room fell away behind us. The hallway was marble-floored and high-ceiling, the kind of institutional space that amplifies every sound. Daniel came through the door 30 seconds after I did, alone. He'd left his mother in the room. I didn't know yet whether that was a choice or just logistics. He stopped a few feet away from me, jacket slightly rumpled, hands in his pockets, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The rain was visible through the tall window at the end of the hall, blurring the street outside into grey watercolour shapes. I didn't know she was going to do that, he said. I let the sentence sit between us. Clara, I genuinely did not know she had prepared. I had no idea about the list, you have to believe me. Did you know she was planning something, I asked. My voice was level. I'd found the level tone somewhere in the last 5 minutes, and I was holding on to it with both hands, because beneath it was something large and unsteady that I wasn't ready to release in a marble corridor in City Hall. He looked at the floor just for a second, just long enough. She mentioned she wanted to say a few words, he said. A toast, I thought. A blessing. Something traditional. He looked up. I swear I thought it was going to be something nice. Something traditional, I repeated. Clara, a list of 12 rules, Daniel, printed in a cream envelope at our civil ceremony. I kept my voice quiet. That is not something you improvise. She typed that up. She formatted it. She brought it here in an envelope she chose specifically for the occasion. And you had a feeling it was coming. And you said nothing to me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of everything he wasn't saying, and everything I was only now beginning to understand about the specific architecture of his cowardice. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't even a dishonest one. Not really. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life managing his mother's expectations by managing everyone else around her, smoothing surfaces, redirecting attention, keeping the peace by ensuring that the people who might object were never quite prepared enough to do so effectively. I had been managed right up until the moment I picked up the microphone. I need to know something, I said, and I need you to answer me honestly right now, before we go back in that room. I looked at him directly. Do you agree with any of those rules? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I think she comes from a different generation. That is not what I asked you. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Conflict, I think. Genuine conflict, the kind that comes from being pulled between two people you can't afford to lose. Except that he had been making that calculation for years, and the answer had always structurally come out the same way. No, he said finally, I don't agree with them. He said it quietly, and he said it clearly, and I believed him. And that made it both better and worse because it meant he had stood in that room and listened to all 12 rules read aloud to his future wife in front of her father and their friends. And he had said nothing. Not because he agreed, because he couldn't make himself move. My father appeared at the end of the corridor. He didn't approach, just let himself be visible, a quiet anchor at the edge of the scene. I was grateful for him in a way I didn't have language for. Here is what I am willing to do, I said to Daniel. I am willing to rest you, as I said, not cancel, reschedule. But before we stand in front of Mrs. Ellison and sign anything, 3 things need to happen. First, you and I have a real conversation. Not later, not tomorrow, now, today, this afternoon. Second, you speak to your mother directly, not after she leaves town, not in a carefully timed phone call next week, today in front of me. Third, I paused. I need to understand what that envelope actually was, because 12 rules in a cream envelope brought to a civil ceremony is not a tradition. It is a statement of intent, and I need to know whether you understand the difference. Daniel stood very still. The rain outside had intensified, drumming steadily against the glass. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Okay, he said one word. But the way he said it, not as appeasement, not as a bid to stop the conversation, but with a kind of quiet, slightly stunned gravity, told me that something in him had shifted. Whether that shift would hold, I didn't know yet. I had enough structural experience to know that a crack assessed correctly and a crack repaired correctly were 2 very different things. We went back inside. The room had rearranged itself in our absence. Margaret was standing near the window, speaking quietly to Patricia, who was nodding with the expression of someone hearing something confirmed rather than something new. Renee had put her phone away. Lena was sitting with my father now, their chairs angled slightly toward each other. And when I walked back in, she looked at me with her chin slightly raised, a question and an offer in one gesture. I gave her the smallest nod. I'm okay. Not yet. Wait. Mrs. Ellison had returned position with the diplomatic serenity of a woman who billed by the hour and had seen everything. Daniel walked directly to his mother. I watched it happen from across the room. I watched him close the distance between them with a purposefulness that was different from his usual movement. Less apology in the posture, less anticipatory softening in his shoulders. Margaret looked up when he reached her, and her expression shifted in the fraction of a second it took her to read something in his face that she hadn't expected. Patricia took a small instinctive step back. I couldn't hear the words. The room was too large and he was speaking too quietly. But I could read the shape of it, the way Margaret's chin lifted, the way her lips compressed, the way she shifted her weight backward almost imperceptibly. The very specific posture of a woman who has been told something she considers a betrayal by someone she expected to hold the line. She said something, he responded. She said something else longer this time, and I caught the word tradition and the word family and the particular pitch of her voice when she deployed them, that practiced frequency that had worked reliably on Daniel since adolescence. He said something short, 3 words, maybe 4, and Margaret Hall for the second time that morning went completely still. Lena appeared at my elbow with a paper cup of water from somewhere. You're going to want this, she said quietly. She wasn't wrong. What happened next unfolded with the slow, specific detail of something I would replay many times over the following weeks, not obsessively, but with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. Margaret replaced the envelope in her handbag with precise, unhurried movements. She said something to Patricia in a low voice, smoothed the front of her jacket with both palms, and then she looked at me across the room directly without the smile. Just a look, assessing, recalculating, acknowledging something she hadn't been willing to acknowledge before, which was simply this. I had not folded. Then she sat down. I turned back to Mrs. Ellison, who was watching me with an expression I could only describe as quiet professional respect. We will need to reschedule after all, I said. But perhaps we could take 20 minutes first. I have a few questions for my fiancé's family. What I had was not questions. What I had was a great deal more than that. And Margaret, I think, already knew it. Because here is the thing about that cream envelope that I hadn't yet told anyone. Not Lena, not my father, not Daniel. I had seen it before. Not the envelope, the rules. 6 weeks earlier, I had been at Daniel's apartment, helping him sort through a stack of papers he'd let accumulate on his home office desk. Old invoices, insurance documents, a warranty card for a coffee machine he'd thrown away 2 years ago. I was making piles while he worked through emails. And somewhere in the middle of the stack, I had found a single printed page folded in thirds with my name at the top. For Clara, duties and expectations, Holt family. I had read 12 numbered items in a clean serif font and then stood very still for a long moment with the page in my hand. I had put it back in the stack exactly where I found it, and I had said nothing. I had not said nothing because I was afraid. I had not said nothing because I was uncertain. I had said nothing because I was even then still trying to extend a margin of benefit of the doubt so wide that it had required me to temporarily misplace my own judgment. I told myself it might be old, something Margaret had drafted and given Daniel as a joke or as a provocation, or as one of her pointed little tests of loyalty. I told myself it didn't necessarily mean what it obviously clearly meant, which was that his mother had written a document detailing how she expected his future wife to live, and that this document had been sitting folded in thirds in my fiancé's apartment. I had given him 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks he had said nothing to me. That single fact that he had seen those rules, kept them, and brought me to the altar of a civil ceremony without a word, was the thing I hadn't yet put into the conversation in the corridor. Not because I'd forgotten it, because I was saving it. Because if there was going to be a real conversation today, I needed it to be complete. I needed everything on the table under the light where we could all see it clearly. I crossed the room toward the window where Daniel was now standing alone, his mother having retreated to her seat. My heart was beating steadily, deliberately, the way it does when you've moved past panic into something more functional. Daniel, I said quietly, I need to tell you something. He turned. I found that list 6 weeks ago in your apartment in the stack of papers on your desk. I watched his face go through several things very quickly. Confusion, recognition, and then something that looked uncomfortably like the beginning of an explanation. I held up one hand very slightly. I'm not telling you this to attack you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I have been waiting for 6 weeks for you to bring it to me, and you didn't. The colour had drained from his face. Not dramatically, just a slight dimming, the way a room looks when a cloud passes over the sun. Clara, he said. I didn't. I thought she was just I didn't think she would actually, you kept it. I said you didn't throw it away. You didn't call her and say, this is not acceptable. You didn't bring it to me. You kept it and you said nothing, and you brought me here today. My voice was still level, still quiet. But there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not anger, not accusation, but the specific, unmistakable weight of someone who'd finished waiting. He put his hand over his face. Just for a moment, just one, I know, he said from behind his hand. I know. And across the room, Margaret Hull watched us with eyes that were very still and very careful. And for the first time since I'd known her, she did not look like someone who had already decided how the story ended. The 20 minutes I had asked Mrs. Ellison for stretched into 45. She took herself and her folder to an adjacent office with the grace of someone who genuinely did not want to know the details. And the ceremonial room became something else entirely. Not a place of celebration, but a room where long-postponed things were finally forced into the light. I pulled 2 chairs away from the rows and set them facing each other near the window. The rain had softened to a persistent grey drizzle. I sat in one chair and looked at Daniel until he sat in the other. My father remained near the door, not to block it, but because that was where he naturally positioned himself when he was protecting something. Lena had taken Renee and Patricia gently but firmly into the corridor with the efficient social authority she had spent 15 years developing that left Margaret. Margaret, who had not been invited to sit in the second chair, remained standing near the wall, handbag clasped in both hands, watching the scene with the focused attention of someone who has just realised the play has changed its ending. Sit down, Margaret, I said. It was the first time I had used her name without any softening around it, no Mrs. Holt, which she preferred, no careful upward lilt at the end that communicated difference, just her name, said the way you say the name of someone whose behaviour has forfeited the formality. She sat. I turned back to Daniel. I had organised my thoughts in the corridor, and I intended to use that organisation now, because I had learned early in my career that the clearest thinking happens not when you are most emotional, but when you have moved through the emotion and arrived at the structure on the other side. I was there now, the structure was visible. I intended to walk through it one beam at a time. I want to understand something from the beginning, I said to Daniel, not from this morning, from the beginning. I kept my voice conversational. No raised pitch, no tremor, just the steady cadence of someone who has decided to be honest regardless of where it leads. When did your mother first talk to you about how she expected me to behave after we were married? He was quiet for a moment. Not the guilty quiet of someone deciding how much to hide, but the more complicated quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth they can actually bear to say in front of 2 people at once. About a year ago, he said, she started asking questions about your schedule, your salary. He paused. Whether you were planning to keep working full-time after we had kids, and what did you tell her? I told her it was none of her business. He said it with a conviction that almost convinced me and might have fully convinced me on a different day. But there was something slightly rehearsed in the rephrasing, none of her business. The kind of line that sounds definitive but functions as a redirect, moving the conversation away from the substance rather than closing it. Did she stop asking? He looked at his hands. Daniel. No, he said. She didn't stop. She asked differently in smaller ways. And I kept thinking that once we were actually married, once she saw how things were, he stopped himself. He knew how the sentence ended. If he'd been finishing it in his head for a year and it had never resolved into anything he could say out loud, she'd accept it, I said. Yes. Or you were hoping the problem would just become smaller on its own. He didn't answer, he didn't need to. I turned to Margaret. She had the expression of a woman who had expected to be the one asking questions in this room, and was adjusting in real time to the reversal. Her composure was remarkable. I had to give her that. A lesser manipulator would have deflected immediately into tears or grievance. Margaret simply sat very straight and waited, which was its own kind of strategy. If you don't speak, you can't be caught in what you say. If you wait long enough, the other person fills the silence with something you can use. I had no intention of filling the silence. I let it sit between us for a full 10 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, not so long as to become theatre. Then I said, when did you decide to bring the list? It's a family tradition, she said. Her voice was smooth, uninflected, calibrated to the exact frequency of reasonable. You've said that twice now, I said. I looked up the whole family on the county records when Daniel and I got engaged. I like to know the history of things. Your mother-in-law's civil ceremony was in 1974. Your own was in 1986. Neither ceremony had a record of any interruption. No tradition on file with this court either, which I also checked. I watched her face. Nothing moved on its surface, but something shifted behind it. A very slight recalibration. So, let me ask the question differently. When did you personally decide to write those 12 rules and bring them to my ceremony? A pause. Then, I wrote them because I care about this family. Because I watched my son fall in love with a woman who has made it very clear that her career is her priority. And my career, I said, funds 40% of the down payment on the house your son and I are purchasing together, which I assume you know since Daniel tells you most things. I didn't say it with heat, I said it like a fact because it was so. I'm curious about rule 1 and specifically the one about a wife's first responsibility being to her husband's household, not her career. Did you account for the mortgage in that rule? Or was that an oversight? Saying something crossed Daniel's face that I would later identify thinking back as the very specific expression of a man who's watching someone do precisely what he has spent years wishing he could do and has never managed. He looked at his mother, then he looked at me, then he looked at the floor. And the shape of his posture, the slight forward hunch, the released tension in his jaw, told me that something in him was not sorry this was happening. Margaret's chin lifted. This isn't about money, she said. It's about values. Whose values? I asked. Family values, she said, with the clean confidence of someone deploying a phrase that has never failed to stop a conversation before. The family that exists, I said, or the family you planned. I watched her blink just once involuntarily. Because the family that exists is me, Daniel, and eventually, if we are very lucky and very careful, children we haven't had yet. I'm the person he is marrying, not a role you've written for me, not a list in a cream envelope. Me, I paused. And what I need to know, Margaret, what I genuinely, sincerely need to understand is whether you are capable of relating to me as that person, or whether everything you've done for the last year has been an attempt to replace that person with the one you would have chosen. The room was absolutely silent. Daniel had gone very still in his chair. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, and this was the thing I had not expected, the first genuine thing I had seen from her in 3 years of careful performance. Her eyes filled, not with the practiced tears she used as leverage, the kind that appeared on cue and evaporated the moment they'd served their purpose. These were different, slower. She blinked once, twice, and did not let them fall. But they were there, and they were real, and they changed the shape of the room. I raised him, she said. Her voice had lost its smoothness. What was underneath was something older and raw. Not malice, or not only malice, but fear. The very specific fear of a woman who had built her entire identity around a family structure and was watching it organize itself around someone else's axis. I raised him on my own for 20 years, and she stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at her hands. I know, I said, and I did know. I had known it for a long time. Had known that the cruelty and the control were not separate from the love, but tangled with it, grown through it the way a wire grows through a tree, until you can't remove one without damaging the other. That knowledge did not make me more willing to be managed, but it made me more willing to be honest. And I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm asking you to let him be married. Another silence, longer this time. Daniel reached across the small space between the 2 chairs and put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand there and left it. And the weight of it, the specific, deliberate weight of a choice, finally made in the right direction, settled into me quietly. There's something else, Daniel said. He was looking at his mother. I need you to know that I found the list in my desk 6 weeks ago, Mum. The first draft, the one you must have given me to review. I should have called you the same day. I should have told you that it wasn't something I was willing to bring to our ceremony, or any ceremony, or any room that Clara was in. I didn't. He paused. That's on me. I want to be clear that I'm not putting all of this on you. I made choices too. I kept things from Clara that I shouldn't have kept. I let things go on too long because I kept waiting for them to resolve on their own. He looked at me. They don't. I know that now. Margaret was looking at her son with an expression I had never seen her wear before. Something unguarded and almost young, as though she had temporarily misplaced the 63 years of carefully maintained composure. I only wanted, she began. I know what you wanted, Mum, he said gently but without retreat. But it's not yours to want. I stood up, not because the conversation was over. It wasn't, not remotely. There were months of these conversations ahead, maybe years, and some of them would be worse before they were better. But I had said what I came to say. The structure I had been examining for 3 years was finally fully visible, and visible structures can be worked with, reinforced or demolished, repaired or replaced, but not ignored. That was the part that mattered. I walked to the window. The rain had stopped. The street below was dark and wet, and the light was coming through the clouds in that specific tentative way it does after a long grey morning. Lena appeared at the door, read the room in approximately 1 second, and came to stand beside me. You doing okay? She asked very quietly. In the private register, we developed over 15 years of friendship. I don't know yet, I said honestly. She nodded. That's the right answer. My father crossed the room and put his hand briefly on my shoulder. One firm press, then gone. He didn't offer an opinion. He didn't explain himself. It was so purely him that I almost laughed. Behind us, I heard Margaret say Daniel's name quietly, tentatively in a register I hadn't heard her use with him before, stripped of its usual architecture of authority. I didn't turn around. Whatever that conversation was, it was theirs to have. What I was thinking about standing at the window with Lena was the list, not the 12 rules. Those I had already filed into the category of things that happened and will not define me. I was thinking about the one rule that hadn't been on it, the one that Margaret, in all her careful preparation, had somehow failed to include. The rule that a woman who builds things for a living knows how to read the structure of what she's being handed. The rule that someone who has chosen to stay quiet for 6 weeks while gathering information is not naive. The rule that the person you underestimate in a room is almost always the one holding the real blueprint. I had been holding mine for 6 weeks. And today, in this wood-panelled room with its tall windows and its smell of old paper, in front of Mrs. Ellison and my father and my best friend and the family I was choosing and the family I was marrying into, I had finally unrolled it. What happened next would depend, as it always does, on what people were willing to build. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us in that room knew, standing in the quiet aftermath of a morning that had already held more than a morning should, was what Patricia had been typing into her phone during the ceremony, or who she'd been typing it to, or what that single message sent at 11:17 in the morning from the third row of the ceremonial room was about to set in motion. I found out 3 days later, and it was worse than the list. Patricia had sent the message to Gordon Hole, Daniel's uncle, the family's lawyer for 30 years, the man whose name appeared as co-signatory on the deed of Daniel's childhood home, not as owner, but in a capacity I had noticed 8 months ago and quietly filed under Understand Better before signing anything. The message Lena had glimpsed when Patricia held her phone at the wrong angle read, "She walked out. Plan B, Plan B." I turned that phrase over for 3 days. The night of the ceremony, lying awake beside a sleeping Daniel. Over coffee the next morning, and by the third day I stopped turning it over and started pulling the thread. I know how to research. Architects don't build on untested ground. You study the soil, the history of the site, what stood there before and why it failed. That was how I'd found the original list in Daniel's apartment. That was how I'd checked the civil ceremony records before confronting Margaret. And that was how on the third morning, I sat down with a cup of coffee and one very specific question and followed it wherever it led. The question was, what does Gordon Hole have to do with the house? Not Daniel's childhood home, our house. The 1920s craftsman with the original hardwood floors and the overgrown garden and 11 days left until closing. The one whose down payment was 60% mine and 40% Daniel's. Split clearly, documented openly, discussed without discomfort. Or so I had believed. I started with the public records, standard research, property transactions, deed transfers, title history. I had done a version of this 8 months ago and found nothing concerning. But that was before I knew Plan B existed. Before I understood the scale of what Margaret had been building, and before I understood slowly rises that the list of 12 rules had never been the plan itself. It was the distraction. The plans was the house. I found it at 11:15 on a Thursday morning. A document filed with the county recorder's office, 9 days earlier after our purchase agreement was signed, after financing was approved, after every major decision had been made and documented. A notice of intent to contest beneficial ownership filed by the Holt Family Trust, a legal instrument designed to assert a financial claim on a property before title transfers. The Holt Family Trust had been established 11 months ago. Its registered agent was Gordon Hole. Its listed beneficiaries were Margaret Hole, and I read the names twice, Daniel James Hole, my fiancé. I closed the laptop, opened it again, read the document from the beginning slowly. The trust had been created 1 month after our engagement, funded with $42,000, roughly equivalent to Daniel's share of our down payment. The legal theory that Daniel's contribution had originated from a family financial transfer, making it trust money, giving the trust a claim on the asset, a foothold in our home. Not ownership, but the kind of foothold that opens a door that becomes very difficult to close, especially when the man holding it has been litigating family property for 30 years. I called my attorney, Sarah Vance, first. She listened, asked for the filing number, and said, "Send it to me. Give me 2 hours." Then I called my father, who listened without interrupting and asked only one question when I finished. "Did Daniel know about the trust?" "His name is on it as beneficiary," I said. A pause. "That doesn't necessarily mean he knew." "No," I agreed, "but it doesn't mean he didn't." I sat with that uncertainty for 2 hours. I didn't clean, didn't answer emails, didn't do any of the reasonable things routine suggested. I sat at my desk with the document and thought about the past 11 months. Daniel's unusual insistence on using a specific account for the down payment transfer, his slight evasiveness when I'd asked about it once, just a family account, easier for the transfer. I hadn't pushed, I'd trusted him. That word had a different texture. Now Sarah called at 2:15. The filing is legitimate. She said, the theory is weak, but not frivolous. A competent attorney could delay your closing for months. The most effective counter is if Daniel formally withdraws from the trust and replaces the seed contribution from his personal funds. That removes the legal basis entirely. A pause. Clara, is there any possibility Daniel was aware of this filing? I looked at his name in the beneficiary line. I'm going to find out today, I said. I called him at 2:30. Come over now. He arrived in 20 minutes. I handed him the open laptop without a word. I watched him read. I watched for the thing that would tell me whether I was looking at a man encountering a surprise or a man encountering something he'd hoped I wouldn't find. What I saw was genuine confusion first, the kind that slows the breathing and puts small lines between the eyebrows, then recognition, then underneath that, the surfacing of something he had half known and chosen not to examine. Family account, I said. He sat down, hands flat on his knees, the face of a man who has been avoiding a moment and has finally run out of directions to retreat. My mother offered to hold the funds, he said. She said she had a high-yield account that would earn better interest while we finalised the purchase. It seemed normal. She's done things like that before. He paused. She had me sign a form. Said it was for tax purposes. We both sat with that. He had signed a form. Margaret had called it taxes, and he had signed it without reading carefully, because that was the trust she had spent 40 years building in him. The automatic compliance that let her operate in the space his faith created. She had put his name on a legal instrument designed to claim his future home using his own money and his own signature. And he had let it happen because she told him it was about taxes. If I hadn't found this filing, I said, if we'd gone to closing without my knowing, what do you think would have happened? He was quiet. Then she would have waited until we were settled, until we felt secure. And then she would have shown up with Gordon and told us the trust had a claim and that if we wanted it removed, we'd need to meet certain conditions. He didn't finish the sentence. Conditions that might have resembled 12 rules, I said. He nodded. Something in his expression had moved past guilt and arrived somewhere harder. The specific look of a man seeing his mother clearly for the first time without the habitual softening of a lifetime. She used my own money, he said quietly, to build a trap in my own house. Yes, I said. He called Sarah, then his own attorney, Peter Chen, who joined by phone and proved to have detailed knowledge of family trust law. The counter-filing was prepared the same afternoon. Gordon Holt was informed that the documents Daniel had signed were obtained under misrepresentation, and that if the trust didn't voluntarily withdraw within 48 hours, the matter would be referred to the State Bar's Professional Conduct Committee. Gordon withdrew the filing the next morning, 41 minutes after the office opened. That evening, Daniel called his mother. I sat across the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of tea and listened. He didn't shout. He spoke in a voice I had never heard him use with her. Not cold, because cold is another kind of distance, and what he was doing was the opposite. He was standing in the space between them for the first time without managing it. He told her what he had found. He told her he knew about the form. He told her that Peter Chen had been specific about the legal characterization of what she and Gordon had done, and that he was choosing not to pursue it formally, but that it was his choice to make, and she should understand that clearly. He told her the September wedding was not cancelled. She could attend as a guest, not as an authority, not as the woman with the envelope. If she couldn't accept that distinction, she should tell him now. A long silence on the line. I only ever wanted, Margaret began. I know, Mum, he said, but you can't have it, and I need you to understand. I'm not saying that because Clara asked me to. I'm saying it because it's true. What you built was not love. It was control, and I'm not going to live inside it anymore. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all its architecture. What was underneath was something small and tired and for the first time completely real. I don't know how to just be your mother, she said. I've been managing everything for so long. I don't know what's left if I stop. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say. Daniel looked at me across the table. Then maybe we figure that out together, he said to her. Slowly, but from here. He set the phone down. We sat in the quiet of the kitchen. Takeout going cold between us, the refrigerator humming, the ordinary sounds of a life continuing around a conversation that had changed its shape permanently. How do you feel? I asked him. He thought about it honestly, the way he always did when he wasn't reaching for the convenient answer. Like a building that just had its foundation redesigned, he said. Unstable, but more sound, maybe long-term. I looked at him. You've been spending time with an architect. The corner of his mouth moved. Small but real, the first genuine one in days. We married in September. The civil signing happened quietly in October. Mrs. Ellison's office, my father, and Lena as witnesses. No envelopes. The September wedding was the other kind. Flowers, 80 guests, the dress I'd spent 4 months choosing. A good day, not perfect. Perfect days are a myth, but warm and real and full of the specific joy that comes from having survived something and arrived on the other side, still standing, still choosing. Margaret came, navy dress, 4th row, no interruptions. At the reception, she held on a moment longer than expected when she hugged me and said quietly where no one else could hear, "I'm sorry," I said. "I know because I did." The Craftsman House closed in October as scheduled. The hardwood floors were everything I had hoped. The garden, under 2 years of neglect, turned out to be genuinely beautiful. Old roses, a lavender hedge, a fig tree that produced more fruit than we knew what to do with. I set up my home office in the south-facing room. Daniel made hazelnut coffee every morning. On Sundays, we cooked together, which we discovered we both loved. One of those quiet pieces of compatibility you find when the extraordinary drama finally clears, and you're left with the real thing. Gordon Holt retired in November, citing health reasons. His office was now a yoga studio. I found that genuinely satisfying. On a Tuesday evening in late November, I sat on the front porch with a glass of wine and watched the street go dark. Autumn leaves came down from the oak at the edge of the property, slow and unhurried. The kitchen light was on behind me. Through the window, I could see Daniel moving through it. I thought about the rainy morning that started all of this, the marble corridor, the sound of a chair skipping on a wood floor, the microphone, cold and solid in my hand. I had set it down, but I had not left. I had stayed and demanded honesty and received it imperfectly, incrementally, the way honest things always arrive. Not all at once, not cleanly, but real. Marriage is not a document. It is a set of daily choices about what you are willing to build and what you refuse to tolerate inside the structure you're building. I had learned that with the clarity of someone forced to see it plainly in a wood-panelled room in front of everyone who mattered. The door opened. Daniel came out with his own glass and dropped a sweater over my shoulders without asking, because after 3 years he knew I ran cold in autumn. He sat beside me. We watched the last leaves come down. What we had now had been tested comprehensively. It had held not because it was perfect, but because when the weight came, we had chosen honesty over pretense and repair over retreat. That is the only foundation that actually lasts. I had known that professionally for years. Now I knew it in every other way.